last class on, at least for now, about the Jewish Bible. Obviously, I have not accomplished what I was hoping to accomplish, to cover the entire Bible, but at the same time, there were too many things that I found to be important and I had to talk about them. Luckily, we will have many more opportunities to continue, or at least to emphasize different aspects of the Bible. So, for example, we might choose another time just to focus on the prophets as a unit, or maybe some prophets, with the idea of not feeling like we are in a rush to cover and rush. Next month, our focus will be much more on the Middle East and Israel. So that's another reason that I'm not taking, I don't want to continue. There is election in Israel, the fourth election in 2 years on March 23rd. And it's so complicated that even people who are extremely well versed in what's happening there are confused. So I will try first to educate myself even more than I am right now, to decipher what's happening, because there are new political parties and new players that some of whom you have not heard of. So that's one of the goals I have for next month, as well as to talk about what's happening in the Middle East. We talk about the new Biden administration and Iran. They are going to join the Iran deal, no Iran deal, and some other, the Saudis. So a lot of interesting things happened in the past several months since our last meeting on the Middle East. So I would love to use this opportunity, or several different opportunities, to discuss that. So what I want to do tonight as our last class is to choose a different order, because tonight we start the festival of Purim. We will acknowledge it tomorrow during services, and we'll do some things about it. But I feel a need to talk a little bit about the Megillah and the background of what was happening, what's happening there in ancient Persia. And I want to go from where we stopped last week with the judges, and to go through some of the kings, at least the important ones. So I decided to begin with an important text from the book of 2 Kings. This text was written after the destruction of Judah. So I'm going backwards, okay? So let me explain what happened. The first king of Israel, and I will talk more about it towards the end of the class. The first king was King Saul. The king after him was King David. And David was really the first king who was able to unify the 12 tribes of Israel and to create a monarchy, a united monarchy. David came from the tribe of Judah in the south, and he was able to solidify all the other tribes. After David, his son Solomon became the king. And he also was able to be the king, or to rule the entire united monarchy, the south as well as the north. So if we place King David at the year of 1000 BCE, we put, let's say, King Solomon around 960. And at 922 BCE, right, we go backwards because it's all BCE, King Solomon dies. And his son, Jeroboam, assumed that he was going to sit on his father's throne, only that the people around him were not so thrilled. When he went to the different tribes and asked them to enthrone him as the new king, they said, okay, we will do it, but only if you promise to relieve us from the tremendous taxes that your father levied on us. And we read in the beginning, in the book of Kings, what Solomon did. He lived very lavish life, and he needed a lot of money for his expenses, for the army, and he needed people to work for him, right? So he needed women to be his cooks and to join his harem. His harem had 700 wives and 300 concubines, okay? So he needed a lot from the people, and they told Jeroboam, his son, okay, if you promise to lighten the yoke, we would support you. So Jeroboam, that's one of the it's really a fascinating story, which is so relevant. So Jeroboam went to his father's advisors, to the generation of the older people, and asked them, what should I tell the people? And they told him, just say yes to all of their requests. Say yes, they'll make you the king, and then you can do whatever you want. Then he went to his peers, the young people, and asked them, what should I do? And they said to him, you should show them who is the king here, who is the man. You should go out there and tell them that you are not going to get any demands from them. And what he said to them was basically, in a biblical way, not the nicest thing to say, but the way he put it was that my little pinky is bigger than my father's penis. Not very nice thing to say, meaning I'm much stronger, bigger, important. I'm a greater man than my father. So you're not going to threaten me. That's not my saying. That's what he said, by the way, just to make it clear that that's not my imagery that I use. In any case, they heard what he said to them, and they said, okay, so we're leaving. So the south, meaning his tribe, Judah, and a little bit of Benjamin, kept Jeroboam as the king. So when you think about south, think about Jerusalem and south. But the rest of the 10 tribes from Jerusalem up north said, we don't want you as a king. And they chose another king, Rehoboam. So since the year 922 BCE, we have two kingdoms. The northern one was Israel. The southern one was Judah. These kingdoms had a lot in common, but sometimes they were fighting against each other. Sometimes they had to collaborate for economic and some wars against common enemies, but completely two monarchies, which means that in the past 3,000 years, we had a united monarchy, Israel was united only for 80 years out of these 3,000 years. Then we had another short period during the Hasmoneans, that's the Hanukkah story. And now we are in the 73rd year of the modern state of Israel. Okay, so if you hear some people who say today that Israel has to be careful because we are quite well known as people who cannot get along with each other, and ultimately we bring our own doom, there is something to learn from history. But that's not about modern Israel. I just want to put things in context because I read a few articles in the past several years that said, well, even after David and Solomon were the only two people who could hold it together, and then the Hasmoneans for a short period of time. So two different monarchies. At the year of 722, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. So that's a very important year to remember, 722. Many people ran south, fled south to Judah, even though they were not the same nation, still, they were very close. About a third of the people were forced into exile. And what the Assyrians did, as many other big empires did at the time, was to exile about 1/3 and then to bring another group from another place. So they brought the Samaritan and some others into the same territory, okay, and tried to mix up the populations, the old population, the Israel, as well as some others, in order for people not to have this sense of loyalty to the place, because now you have a different mix of people. Since 722, there is no Israel. Okay, you heard about the lost tribes. These are the lost tribes, and they have been lost for 3,000 years, or a little bit less, but close to it, and we never found them. Sometimes we have some places, I know in Africa, in Asia, who said we are the real descendants of the 10 tribes. I don't know about that, but there was no Israel. All we had was Judah since 722. But at the year of 556 or 57, when I'm saying the years, it really depends, because the Bible doesn't say to us, oh, that's 566, 567. We try to figure it out mostly based on extra biblical sources. The Babylonians destroyed Judah, exiled the people, many of the people, brought new population in, did the same thing. And since then, the majority of the Jews were in exile. Okay? So these are very important years. First, the 10 tribes were exiled. This is the northern kingdom of Israel, and then the southern kingdom of Judah. And we are Jews because we are descendants of the tribe of Judah. Okay, so before that, before the split of the kingdom, there was no point of talking about Jews because they were Israelites. But then there were Israelites versus Judeans, okay, or later on Jews, okay? So we are all descendants of this tribe of Judah that survived. They were exiled all across the Babylonian Empire. And that's where I was going with this historical account, because the next empire that took over, that defeated the Babylonians, were the Persians. And the Persians were quite nice to the Jews, despite the story of the book of Esther that I'm going to talk about briefly in a few moments. Because about 50 years after the exile of the Jews from Judah or Judea, the Persian king, King Cyrus, gave them a permission to go back and to rebuild their state back in Judah. And not only that King Cyrus gave them a permission to do that, he encouraged them, sent them with some money and some experts, because they needed to rebuild the temple that the Babylonians destroyed. And they needed some leaders, because when a country occupies the smaller countries and exile part of the population, they exile the elite. Because without the elite, without the leaders, without the priest, without the craftsmen, it's really hard to survive. And if you get rid of them, you'll get little resistance. So King Cyrus encouraged all the former elite to go back. Some of them went back. Many of them chose to stay around the Persian Empire because life was better. Okay, people normally like to live where life is easier and better. Around that time, we have a group of Jews, a Jewish community in Susa, or Shushan, the way it's written in the Torah. as part of the Persian Empire. Okay, so let's say that we are now talking about 460 or so. Okay, so let's say about 100 years or so after the Babylonians exiled the Jews from Judea. That's where the story of Purim takes place. I don't know if you ever read the entire Megillah. That's what they call the Aganze Megillah, right? The whole, because we normally don't. But it's worth reading. It's really worth reading, even if there are some boring details with some long names, because there are many Persian words there and many Persian names that are very long. And even if you read Hebrew well, you will stumble on these words, because most of us would, unless we know them very well. It was written partly as a comedy that was based on some historical events. But so the background or the backdrop against which it was written was historically somewhat accurate, but the story meant to give Jews in exile hope. It tells the story of anti-Jewish or anti-Semitism, if you will, the way it happened many, many times afterwards in history. Somebody doesn't like the Jews, or somebody doesn't like a particular Jew and decides to get rid of all the Jews. So the story begins with this banquet. King Ahasuerus invited all the men of the kingdom, the important men, to this feast. No women were allowed. A lot of eating and much more drinking. And then at one point, he invited his wife to appear before all the men, probably naked. That was Vashti. She refused. And his advisors, who was as smart probably as the advisor of King Jeroboam, told him, you have to get rid of her. Because if you will not get rid of her, all the women of the kingdom of Persia will do the same, and none of them will obey their husband. Okay, so some people take it seriously, some people take it as a parody. Okay, read it in any way you want. So I said, no, you have to be the example of a man. Men should be tough with the wives, and you have to get rid of your wife. So that will teach all the women in the kingdom to obey their husbands, to be good wives. He did it, only to regret a short time later, because he loved his wife. But it was too late. So they spent a whole year trying to choose an appropriate queen for him. When we tell the story to the children, even when we tell it on the bima, often we like to think about it as a beauty contest. It was not. It was a year of preparing, beautifying the women in different kinds of oils and treatments. And the king would try them out sexually throughout that time. Okay, so it was not, this is not really a story for kids. We love the kids' story, the version, but there is a lot of sex and alcohol in this story, more than in any other part of the Bible. And Esther was part of this group because her uncle, Mordechai, encouraged her to do it. But more and more scholars believe that Esther didn't really have a choice, because the decree was that all the good-looking young virgins have to go to that place and to be candidates to be part of the king's harem. Esther was Mordechai's, I'm not good with these family relations. I think she was his cousin. Often we said niece, but it's not accurate. He was her uncle, he was her cousin. Yeah, they were both cousins, but he was a man and older. She had no parents. So she was Mordechai's surrogate daughter in a way. At the same time, we read King Ahasuerus elevated Haman to be second in command. So Haman became the most important person. And Mordechai happened to have a position also in the king's court. Only that these guys, Haman and Mordechai, didn't like each other. Last week, I gave a sermon on Friday and I explained a different way to look at the story. But the way we read it was that Haman, when he became the big shot, wanted everyone to bow down to him. And Mordechai say, I'm a Jew, I'm not bowing down to any person. And Haman decided that because Mordechai was so rude and refuses to heed his decree, not only he's going to punish Mordechai, he's going to kill all the Jews. So Haman went to King Ahasuerus and said, and this is a very important line, so there is one nation in your entire empire that is spread all over the place. Their religion is different than the others. The language is different. Everything about them is different. And here is my offer to you. You're going to give me permission to kill them all. And after I do that, I will give you a big chunk of the booty. I'm going to give you 10,000 silver coins. And the king was quite happy. He didn't really care much about it. He was offered a nice sum of money, and kings always needed money, either for their lavish building projects, their armies, and for big parties. And he said, you can do whatever you want with these people. And this is the meaning of the word Purim. Purim means lots, like lottery. So Haman had a little lottery, picked a day, and the day was the 14th day of the Hebrew month of Adar, which starts tonight at sunset, which I'm looking outside, it's about sunset time. So right now, it's the 14th day of Adar. That was the day that Haman got permission to start the massacre of all the Jews. When Mordechai realized what happened, he went to Esther and said, you have to do something about it because Haman was going to has a plan to kill all the Jews. Now, Esther never told Ahasuerus, her husband, that she was Jewish. The Jews in Persia were quite assimilated. They were very secular. So hiding one's religion, one nationality, was a very easy thing to do. The book of Esther does not mention God even once. People don't pray. People don't keep kosher. There was no issue that Esther married a Gentile king. Okay, all these things that we take for granted, like, no, Jews don't do that. That's exactly what the assimilated Jews did in the Persian exile. Mordechai said, you have to help us. He said, no, I cannot do that because nobody is allowed to approach the king without an invitation. But he convinced her and he said, if you won't do it, we will perish. So she did. She went to the king and said, and he was in a good mood. So when she opened his door, he said, oh, come on, Esther, what do you want? She said, I want to invite you and Haman to a party, just for the two of you. And he was quite happy. He was happy. Haman was happy. As they came to the party, Esther said, you know, there's one thing I want to ask you. You have a plan to kill me and all my people. And he said, what are you talking about? Who wants to kill you? And she said, you see that guy, Haman, he has a plan. I'm a Jew. He wants to kill all the Jews. And of course, King Ahasuerus was angry. Just to make it more comic and put Haman even in bigger trouble. At one point, King Ahasuerus was so angry that he left the room for a moment. And when he was out, Haman approached Esther, who was sort of lying down on the sofa, tried to beg her to change her version of the story. And as the king entered the room, it looked like Haman was trying to seduce his beloved wife. Okay, so that was the end of that. Instead of killing Mordecai and the Jews ended up killing Haman and got permission. Now, the king, even as powerful as he was, he could not change the decree, since there was a law that the Jews should be put to death on the 14th day of Adar. He was not able to change it. What he did was to give Jews the permission to defend themselves. So the Jews, instead of just being the victims of this massacre, were able to defend themselves, and this is the story of Purim. So it gives us a glimpse of how exile looked like, or at least how it was perceived by some people. And another part of the Bible that shows a completely different kind of a community, a secular community, an assimilated community, but still keeps its Jewish identity. Any questions or comments or anything about Purim? About the Megillah, about anything? No Purim. Okay, if this is the case, I want to share a document with you, because this document, this chapter 17 from the book of 2 Kings, tells it is really important, and I'll show in a minute why. But let me just say a word about 2 Kings versus 2 Samuel, or second book of Chronicles. The reason that we have two books, like Samuel 1, Samuel 2, Kings 1, Kings 2, is only because the scrolls were too small. So they had to use two scrolls. Okay, so there is nothing magical about it. It's not, right? So they had to divide it to two, and it was known as the first scroll of Samuel and the second scroll of Samuel, just because it was more convenient. Okay, so if they had bigger scrolls, or if somebody had made the decision to keep them together, we would have had only one. The same we have also in the Talmud that was written later on. One of the tractates was very big, so it was also divided into three. Okay, so but just because of either printing, or in that case, scrolls. So let me share with you the screen of 2 Kings. Okay, so you remember what I said about the destruction of first Israel, the northern kingdom, and then of Judah. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods. Okay, this is the explanation of how come both parts of Israel, the north and the south, were defeated. How come their temples were destroyed? How come other empires were stronger than them? And follow the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. High places in Hebrew is bamot, is a place to sacrifice and to worship. So these are the high places. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles. Asherah was a goddess, and she was normally worshipped as a piece of wood. So the fortification, of Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place, they burned incense as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that aroused the Lord's anger. They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said, "You shall not do this." The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers, "Turn from your evil ways, observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey, and that I delivered to you through my servants, the prophets." But they would not listen and were as stiff-necked as their ancestors who did not trust in the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their ancestors and the statute he had warned them to keep. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. They imitated the nations around them, although the Lord had ordered them, "Do not do as they do." They forsook all the commands of the Lord their God and made for themselves two idols cast in the shape of calves and an Asherah pole. I will talk about these two idols in a minute. They bowed down to all the starry hosts and they worshipped Baal. Baal was the Canaanite god. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire, child sacrifice. They practiced divination and sought omens and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left, and even Judah does not keep the commands of the Lord their God. They followed the practices Israel had introduced. Therefore, the Lord rejected all the people of Israel. He afflicted them and gave them into the hands of plunderers until he thrust them from his presence. I think that would be enough for now. I wanted to read the whole thing for a reason, because this is the way that the Bible chose to explain how come Israel was defeated. We're going to celebrate Passover in about a month or so. And the whole story of Passover is how our God, right, Yahweh, was a stronger God than the Egyptians' God and the Egyptian God's manifestation, Pharaoh. We defeated them and we got everything that God wanted us to get. Later on, we read other stories about how Israel was able to defeat the different enemies. But when the enemies not only defeated Israel, but exiled them, and more than that, destroyed their temple, what does it mean? Does it mean that the other gods are stronger than Yahweh? Right? If the Assyrians defeated Israel, does it mean that the Assyrian god Marduk is stronger than the Israelite God Yahweh? Does it mean that God abandoned the covenant with Israel? How do you explain it? And what should Israel do as a result of this knowledge of this information? Should they go and worship another God? Should they just go home and say, okay, the whole endeavor is done. We had our relationship with God. It was nice as long as it lasted, but it's all over. And what do you think was the main message here that the Book of Kings gives us? Why Israel and Judah were destroyed? If anyone wants to try, you may unmute yourself.
They disobeyed God, and God is punishing them.
They disobeyed God, and God punished them. Okay, let's take it one step forward with that. So that's good. Let's be more specific. What kind of disobedience we see? That's why I wanted to read the entire chapter.
They worshipped other gods. They made their nation. They imitated other nations. They created golden calves. They were warned to change, but they didn't. They would worship building high places. I mean, there was a whole list of stuff there.
The whole list of stuff you can reduce to worship other gods.
Right.
Okay, they were disloyal to God. This is the main argument of the Book of Kings, which is really important. So all these examples that you mentioned, and some that are there and some that will be in some other places, are about idolatry or worshiping other gods, right? If you worship other gods, you're not loyal. This is an act of infidelity, which means you, Israel and Judah, broke the covenant. So I'm God now. I owe you nothing. You broke the covenant. But there is another part to that explanation. Not only, and that's what some scholars believe was the part of the explanation that kept the Jewish people going for 3,000 years afterwards. Because what God said there, not simply I punished you and you lost, but I caused the other nations to defeat you. I used the other nations as a tool to punish you. So it's not now that the Assyrians are stronger, or later on the Babylonians are stronger, or the year 70, the Romans are stronger, their gods are stronger than Yahweh. No, I'm still the God. I'm the strongest, but I can do anything I want. And I use the Assyrians and the Babylonians as a tool, as an instrument with which to punish you for your infidelity towards me. Okay, so it's not that God was defeated. God is even stronger now. That's the message here. Israel messed up, and God just used others to punish them. Now, it's not to say that there were no Israelites and Jews who did not buy that explanation and started to worship other gods, because if the Assyrians defeated, they want to join the stronger nation and to worship the Assyrian god. Okay, but still Israel remained even 2,000 years in exile because of this explanation. Because what we betrayed the covenant, we broke the covenant with God. God used the other nations to punish us. And then, you know what, I'll say it right now. The prophets that will come a little bit later will add two things to this explanation. One is that they will not put so much emphasis on idolatry or other worshiping of other gods as on ethical, moral reasons. That's why the Reform movement, for example, loves, and especially in the past, the prophets so much, because this is the source for all this social action and social justice. Because the prophets it's not that they don't talk about idolatry, but they don't dwell on it so much. They emphasize the morality. So because you oppressed the widows and the orphans, because you did not treat your neighbors right, because you took advantage of the weak and disenfranchised in your society, that's why God used the Assyrians and the others to punish you. Okay, so if in the book of Kings, with the author that we call the Deuteronomistic source, focused only on worshiping other gods, the prophets, many of them would emphasize the unethical behavior of the corruption. Some of the passages that we read on Yom Kippur, for example, from the book of Isaiah, Isaiah quotes God and said, I don't need your sacrifices and your prayers as long as you treat the poor and the orphans and the strangers the way you do. Okay, so that's an interesting shift that the prophets have made. And that's a very important point, because that really turned the Jewish discourse into an ethic-oriented discourse. The other thing that the prophets added is hope. What they emphasize is, yes, God used the other nations to punish you because of all the bad things that you have done, but God ultimately will forgive you and will restore your position and will place you back in your promised land, etc. Because God's covenant with you is eternal. So God may take, of course, they didn't know how long it would take, but God may take 2,000 years, but ultimately you will go back to your promised land. You will reestablish your religious and political center in Jerusalem, the holy city, the city that was perceived as the connection between heaven and earth. And the relationship will be as it has been before, with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses, and the rest. Okay, so now when we look at it, 73 years after the establishment of the modern state of Israel, people who were well versed in the Bible and people who grew up with this kind of theology, and many Jews did, for them to see the establishment of the state of Israel, they could open the Bible and read the prophets prophesying it. Okay, you can understand now, if you look really at the Israeli society, why some of the, especially some of the modern Orthodox in Israel, became very messianic, why it even explains some of the strong connection, or is sometimes even obsession with land. Because when the prophets were talking about restoring the kingdom of David, oh, did it include the West Bank or did not include the West Bank? Was Gaza Strip part of it? Okay, so they read the current political situation back into the prophets, or the other way around. Okay, that's really fascinating. And a lot was written about it, and try to think about yourself in 1948. A flip side that I don't want to talk too much about, but is some Jewish groups, ultra-Orthodox groups, who oppose and still do the existence of Israel, because they believe that it has to start with a miracle, that only God can create the new state of Israel and not the Zionist movement, for example, okay? But it's easy to understand how people look at the establishment of Israel with very religious view. Yeah, the prophets were right. God reestablished God's covenant with us. And here is the proof. And on that background, the way I started, some people say, but remember, it's never lasted more than 100 years or so. So be very careful. God never promised that it will last forever. Okay, so this is something fascinating to see how it unfolds today, how it affects the current politics, how it affects the February 2021 political discourse pre-election. People quote the same stuff that I'm talking about when they talk about the West Bank and annexation and the other things. So I'm going back, right? So I told you a little bit about the history. I went back to exile to Purim. I explained the reasons that the Bible gives to why these two kingdoms were destroyed. And now let me fill the gap between where I stopped last week and today. I'm sorry if it's confusing. I just thought in my head it worked out well, but I'll try to make it clear. So last week, I said that the judges were the leaders of the tribes between the years of 1200 to 1000 BCE. And most of them had some judicial responsibilities, but they were called judges mainly because they were able to lead a tribe or few tribes together in a war against the enemies. And Israel at the time had many enemies. On one side, you had the Ammonites, you had the Moabites. On the other side, that's the west side. On the east side, on the west side, you had the Philistines, and they've been fighting all the time. But that structure of very loose confederation of tribes worked for about 200 years until it stopped working. The enemies became too strong, and they had three major crises. Let's put it at the year of around 1000 BCE. The religious center was in the city of Shiloh or Shiloh. And the main person there was a priest, the high priest by the name of Eli or Eli. We pronounce it, or different people pronounce it differently. In Hebrew, it's Eli in most of the time in English. Eli was a decent guy, only that he had two corrupt sons, and the Philistines were very strong. So we have a problem, a crisis of succession, because his two sons, Hophni and Pinchas, were taking advantage of their position as the sons of the high priest. They were priests themselves. And the way they did it was also connected to food and sex, I guess. That's all we have. I didn't think about that connection to Purim. When a person went to the temple to sacrifice, they brought their animal. The priest slaughtered the animal on their behalf. The person who brought the sacrifice would take the majority of it, but as a payment to the priest, they would give the priest a chunk of the meat. Now, don't think about today. If you feel like buying a piece of meat, you go to Publix and you buy whatever part of the meat that you want. In a pre-refrigeration era, if you wanted a burger, you had to slaughter a cow. So people ate meat very rarely, okay? So for them, it was a big deal to go and to slaughter an animal. In any case, there was a specific part that they had to give to the priest. However, the sons of Eli, Hophni and Pinchas, didn't care what the Torah said that they are allowed to take as their payment. They took the best parts, whatever they wanted and the quantity they wanted. Okay, so that's one example of their corruption. The other one was taking advantage of the women who came to the temple and either force them to have sex or cajole them in different ways, but they took advantage of their vulnerability, and God did not like it. So it was very clear that these two guys would not succeed Eli. That's one problem. We had a religious crisis that was a different problem because he got older and they became the main representatives of the religious leadership, and the Philistine got really stronger. Eli, there was a war with the Philistines where the two sons of Eli died. At one point, they decided to take the Ark of the Covenant. Remember the Ark where the two tablets were, the tablets of the Covenant, the Ten Commandments were stored. They took the Ark with them to the war, hoping that God will help them. Only that it didn't help, and the Philistines captured the Ark, the holiest part of the temple. There was no official temple yet. There was a permanent, a temporary structure in Shiloh. But the most important component was the Ark, and the Philistines captured the Ark. The priest died. When Eli heard what happened, he fell backwards and died. And we have a complete vacuum. That vacuum was filled by a very interesting guy by the name of Samuel. Samuel was a young boy who was donated by his mother to the temple. She said she could not have children, and she made a vow that if she would conceive, she will dedicate her son to the temple. She gave birth and took little Samuel and gave him to Eli to raise, and he worked at the temple. He did whatever he was asked to do until he became it was a combination of the high priest, he was the prophet, he was the military leader, it was everything. Only that he was not strong enough to deal with the Philistines. Samuel was a religious man, and even in some battles, he was able to win some, but mostly by praying and sacrificing. And that was not a very reliable method to defeat the Philistines. So they went to Samuel and say, hey, Samuel, we want a king. And here we see something that goes all over the Bible, this tension between the pro-monarchy and the anti-monarchy, because the Bible seems not to agree whether or not kings are good or bad. The people go to Samuel and say, we need a king. Samuel said, no, it's bad. You have a king. Yahweh is your king. They said, no, not good enough. And the first king that they choose is King Saul. In the beginning, everyone loves Saul. He's a very impressive man. He's handsome. He's the tallest man around. He leads them in some successful battles. And he's even a religious man. He can get some ecstasies when he starts to prophesy. But then a new guy comes into the picture. His name is David. And once David enters the picture, we hate Saul. And the description of Saul from this wonderful guy turns to be a description of a madman. So if in the beginning his religious ecstasies were described in a positive way, I think about this guy who can meditate for hours and starts moving, and the Spirit of the Lord is upon him, to a crazy guy who is obsessed with David and wants to kill him. Ultimately, Saul ends up killing himself during one of the battles against the Philistines, and David becomes the king. David is the ultimate king, but he's very far from being perfect. He has many flaws. I read an amazing book about him by Baruch Halperin. Is one of the scholars. I don't remember where he teaches today. And he really describes who David was. David, the first thing he did was to get rid of every person from the line of Saul. He made sure that there is no male who is a descendant of Saul, and even the female, he either killed or locked to make sure that they'll never have a child who would able to claim any rights to the crown. Okay, so David, and everything was done, of course, under a cover of doing other things. Okay, and after he killed his potential competitors. He lamented them, he was crying, he was sitting Shiva and giving eulogies. But when you really read it with an open mind, you see how methodically he destroyed the entire family of Saul. The second part of David's life was less successful. He's described at the end, the beginning of 2 Samuel, it's on, at the beginning of the book of Kings, I'm sorry, it's described as a very pathetic, impotent old man who is shivering in his bed, he cannot get warm. They bring him a young woman to lie next to him, not with him, just to keep him warm, but that's even not working out. And all of a sudden we hear about a conspiracy between his wife Bathsheba. He had many wives, not only one, but Sheba was his wife, who she and the prophet Nathan had a whole plot of how to make his son Solomon the king. Solomon became the king, and just like his father, started to kill everyone around him, the other brothers, because nobody wants competition. Solomon was successful. Not as successful as the Bible describes, because there's absolutely no evidence that Solomon really controls such a huge territory. But that was a good time to be a king, because the empires, remember I spoke about it the other day, the empires that were around Israel, Egypt in the south, we had the Assyrians, east and northeast, we have the Hittites or the Phoenicians, depends on the periods, up in the north, okay? There was a period of decline of these empires, which means that nobody gave hard time to Israel. So the king of Israel was able to do well, and it seems like Solomon did well, and had very lavish lifestyle. And the Bible describes his major problem as having way too many wives. And it's not so much the number that is obviously exaggerated. Nobody has 1,000 wives. But the problem was that he started to worship other gods. In order to be nice to his wives, he just worshiped their gods. So they were able to build different temples, different shrines to foreign gods during Solomon. Now, I will end here, but this is an important thing to realize. When you read the biblical accounts, many of them were written many years after the fact. So there is a very good chance that when Solomon did have many foreign wives and did build shrines to different gods, that was acceptable. Because today, every country has different embassies, right? So you have these little ex-territories around Washington, D.C., of different countries, because that's the way of diplomacy today. There is a very good, that was the norm back then. But when it was written, when people wrote about Solomon later on, it was not acceptable. In a way that today, all of a sudden, people focus a lot on, for example, George Washington and him owning slaves, okay? When he owned slaves, it was a normative thing to do. Years later, it's not, okay? So people didn't care so much, 1776, that Washington owned slaves, but today people do care. And when they write about him, they criticize him. Okay, so when you think about David and Solomon, some of the things that they did were probably perceived as normative at the time, only that when it was written, or the last reduction of the story that we have, well, it's not acceptable anymore. So it was written in a negative way. And And that's an important thing to always remember when you read the Bible or when you read many of the classic books, because when they describe historical periods and historical events and practices, they are using their contemporary glasses and look back at things that happened many years before them. And often norms change. Okay, so that's that's part of the story. So I think I will end here. So we covered most of the history of the Bible, if you want, because more or less that's where it ends. What I was not able to cover is to pay more attention to the prophets. We have a lot of them, okay? And we have some of the prophets are part of the 4 history books, the 6 history books of Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. So we have prophets who appear there, but then we have the latter prophets, and that I just gave you a little glimpse, but part of the story is interesting. And then we have another whole section of the Bible that is called the writings, the miscellaneous part that has wisdom books like the book of Job, the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Proverbs, that really wisdom philosophy like books with a lot of maxims and ideas. You have the 5 scrolls, in which the book of Esther is one of them. You have the book of Psalms. Okay, so this part we did not touch except of the book of Esther. So in the future, if there is any interest, I would like to have to focus on something smaller than the Jewish Bible. And hopefully we will be able to meet in person at one point, because discussion on Zoom is a nightmare. I mean, we do the best we can, but it's always hard. I know it is as well as a participant, because I participate in a lot of Zoom classes and seminars and meetings, and it's very hard. So I want to wish you happy Purim, almost Shabbat Shalom, and to thank you for the opportunity to review more than half of the Bible with you. So have a good night.
Thank you. It was awesome.
Thank
Rabbi,
you very much.
what was the name? What was the name of the book about David?
I never remember names of books, but the author is Baruch Halpern.
Okay.
If you Google Baruch Halpern, and it's something like a murderer, the word murderer is there, king, murderer, something like that. It's not a new book.
Uh-huh.
And even, and he writes it, it's an academic book, but he writes it in a very interesting way that you can read it almost not as a novel, but I remember not putting it down, really reading it, not like a regular nonfiction book. It's worth, if you are interested, it's really worth reading.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a brilliant guy, this professor.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.